The first time my father struck me in front of 20 relatives, the sound was so sharp it felt like the room itself gasped. One moment I was standing in the entryway holding a dish of rosemary potatoes, cheeks flushed from the cold December air. The next, the platter crashed to the floor, shattering into white shards, and my father's hand was raised again like he was ready to finish what he'd started. My mother didn't scream in shock. She screamed in fury at me. "Pay your sister's rent or get out of my house." Her voice sliced through the Christmas lights, the garland, the half-carved turkey. I tasted blood from biting the inside of my cheek. But I didn't cry. I didn't even speak. I just stood there trembling. Humiliation pouring over me like hot oil while a roomful of relatives stared as if I were the villain ruining their holiday. Everyone watched. No one moved. Not even my sister. And in that frozen moment, as my mother demanded again that I fix the family problem, something inside me whispered that this wasn't a meltdown. This was a plan. I knelt on the floor, gathering broken ceramic with shaking hands, pretending to focus on the mess so I wouldn't have to look at anyone. The smell of roasted ham and cinnamon rolls felt nauseating wrong somehow. Fake. My father stood over me, chest heaving, muttering something about ungrateful children, while my mother hovered nearby, waiting for me to fold the way I always did. My younger sister Ivy sat at the dining table pretending not to watch, though her reflection betrayed her in the polished ornaments hanging behind her. She looked annoyed, not ashamed, not remorseful, just irritated that her performance required patience. "Crystal," my mother snapped. "We've been over this. Ivy can't keep a roof over her head. She needs your help. You make good money. What's $800 to you?" She turned dramatically to the room. "She makes more than all of us, and still hoards every penny." A few relatives murmured, shifting uncomfortably. Not one of them asked why Ivy, healthy and fully employed, was depending on me to pay her rent at 25 years old. "Mom," I said quietly, rising to my feet. "I told you last week. I've already covered 3 months of rent for her. I'm trying to save for a house. I can't keep doing this." My father's face twisted into something meaner, darker. "You don't tell your mother no. Not in my house." I swallowed hard. "I'm 30. I have my own house. This isn't—" The second slap didn't land. Someone grabbed his wrist. Every head snapped toward the doorway where Doan, my boyfriend, stood, snow in his hair, chest rising and falling like he'd sprinted from the driveway. His eyes were locked on my father's hand grip, steady, unafraid. "Don't touch her again," Doan said, his voice low and dangerous. My father yanked his arm away, glaring. "Stay out of family business. If family business means hitting her, I'm not staying out of anything." Murmurs rippled across the room. Someone coughed. Someone else switched off the TV. The whole house shifted attention, rising beneath the tinsel and holiday cheer. Before anyone could speak again, my Uncle Ray stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "Enough," he muttered, reaching into his jacket pocket like his fingers were searching for courage. His face was pale, almost trembling. "Everyone needs to hear something." My mother stiffened. "Ray, don't you dare." But he already had his phone out. "I've been recording conversations at family gatherings for months," he said, voice cracking. "Because I knew something wasn't right." His thumb tapped the screen. My mother's voice filled the dining room, cold and sharp. "Ivy doesn't need to worry about rent. Crystal will pay if we push her. Just apply pressure. She always caves." A wave of shock hit me like a physical force. Ivy looked away. "No, stop, turn that off," my mother screamed, lunging toward Ray. He stepped back. "There's more!" My father roared. "You sanctimonious traitor!" But Ray continued, words tumbling out. "You've been planning this, manipulating her, setting her up. This wasn't about Christmas dinner or rent. This was orchestrated." I felt the room tilt beneath me. My breath shortened, vision narrowing. My mother's face twisted into something I didn't recognize, a mix of fear and fury. "You don't understand what she owes this family." "No," Ray said quietly. We understand exactly what's happening. Doan's hand slid into mine. I didn't realize I was shaking until his thumb brushed my knuckles. For the first time, I felt something unfamiliar rising inside me. Not guilt, not fear. Power. Or maybe the beginning of it. And with every relative staring, every recording waiting to be heard, every lie beginning to unravel, one truth settled like steel in my spine. They weren't losing control. They were realizing they'd already lost it. Doan didn't let go of my hand as the room erupted into layered noise. Accusations, whispers clattering silverware, the soft thump of someone fainting onto a chair. But beneath it all lay a deeper current, a sickening awareness that this moment had been waiting to happen long before I stepped through the door with rosemary potatoes and good intentions. Ray lowered his phone shoulders, sagging like he'd finally dropped a boulder he'd been carrying for years. "I'm sorry, Crystal," he murmured. "I should have said something sooner." My mother shoved past him, seething. "Those were private conversations. You had no right. You had no right to manipulate your daughter." Ray shot back louder than I'd ever heard him speak. "No right to set her up like this." Gasps spread around the table, and all I could think absurdly was how the flickering candles on the mantel made this look like a scene from a family drama no one volunteered to star in. My father slammed his hand onto the table. "Enough! Everyone sit down." Doan stepped forward. "Crystal isn't sitting anywhere with people who put their hands on her." The room froze as my father squared his shoulders at him. For a moment, I genuinely thought Doan would have to fight him to get us out the door. But before my father could lunge or shout or swing again, someone else snapped. Aunt Meredith stood up so fast her chair scraped across the hardwood. She held an envelope in her trembling grip. "Linda," she said to my mother, "I'm sorry, but I can't keep quiet anymore." My mother's head jerked toward her. "Not now, Meredith. Put that away." But Meredith didn't. She looked at me instead. "Crystal, your mother gave me this earlier. She told me to hand it to you once things got heated. She said you'd understand what to do." My stomach contracted. "What is it?" She held the envelope out to me, guilt etched into every line of her face. I didn't look inside. I didn't want to be part of this. My mother lunged for her arm. "Don't give her that." But Doan intercepted, gently guiding Meredith behind him. I tore the envelope open. Thick paperwork slid out dense legal text, highlighted sections, signature lines. At the top of the first page, Financial Liability Transfer Agreement. My name printed neatly at the bottom. My name, but not my signature. The edges of my vision pulsed. I flipped the second page. A third. The numbers made no sense. Thousands owed. Clauses about shared responsibility. Penalties. A co-debtor line listing Ivy. "What is this?" I whispered. Before anyone could answer, Ivy shot up from the dining table so quickly her chair tipped backward. "Mom said you needed to see it later," she blurted. Her voice didn't sound frightened, it sounded angry. It's just paperwork, Crystal. Standard stuff." "Standard?" I stared at my pre-printed name. "Why is this prepared with my information? Why do you want me attached to a loan I've never heard of?" Ivy's face flushed. "It's nothing. It's temporary." "You're blowing it out of proportion." Doan leaned closer, scanning the pages. "This isn't temporary," he said quietly. "This makes her responsible for someone else's debt. All of it." A low ripple spread across the room. My mother clapped her hands loudly like she could reset the moment. "Enough. Crystal, sign it, and we can put all this behind us." "Sign what I asked," voice trembling. "What did you involve me in?" "You're overreacting," she snapped. "Families help each other." Ivy needed Ivy as a second apartment, Doan said calmly, and the room erupted again. Every head swung toward Ivy. I felt her eyes on me, cold, sharp, calculating. For the first time, I recognized something terrifying in her expression. Not desperation. Contempt. My Uncle Ray rubbed his forehead. Ivy, you said you had nowhere to go. That you were weeks from eviction. Ivy's voice cracked, but not from tears. From annoyance. I didn't want everyone knowing my business. Your business, I murmured. I've been draining my savings to help you. And you lied. She lifted her chin. You were fine before. You make plenty. A sharp, buzzing sound interrupted everything. At first, I thought it was the overhead lights flickering. Then I realized it was coming from the corner. Trevor, the teenage cousin who always seemed glued to his phone, held up the device nervously. I thought Mom wanted me to document stuff. So, this is live streaming. Silence swallowed the room whole. How many people Doan asked? Trevor swallowed. 9,000? My mother shrieked. Turn that off. Trevor shook his head helplessly. I can't. People are screen recording already. My father's face drained of color. Ivy's mouth fell open. Linda wheeled around like she could physically grab the truth out of the air. Ray whispered, horrified. It's all out there now. Doan put an arm around my shoulders. Good, he murmured. Let people see what they've been doing. My mother stepped toward me, eyes blazing, voice trembling with more rage than sorrow. Crystal, if you love this family, you will sign those papers right now. You will fix what your sister ruined. You will not embarrass us on Christmas. My father nodded behind her jaw tight. Ivy stared like she was waiting for me to fold. I looked down at the papers again. At my printed name. At the forged shape of my signature. And then slowly, deliberately, I set the stack on the table. I'm not signing anything, I said. The room felt suddenly weightless. Dangerous. Doan's hand tightened on my arm. Crystal, Ivy hissed, all pretense gone, you're ruining everything. But for the first time in my life, I realized something. Freedom didn't come from keeping the peace. It came from finally refusing to. My mother didn't say another word. She just stared at me. Her lips thinning, her eyes turning into slits of cold calculation. That was always the final stage of her anger, not yelling, not crying, but silence sharpened into a weapon. My father, on the other hand, surged forward like a storm cloud ready to burst. You're not going anywhere, he growled, stepping between me and the hallway. I hadn't moved yet. I didn't have to. The threat was symbolic, meant to remind me that he controlled the doorway, the house, the family. But something inside me was still trembling from the word I'd said out loud. No. He hadn't heard that word from me in years. Maybe ever. Dad, I said quietly, move. You think this is a choice? His voice cracked like a whip. You think you get to walk away after what you've done tonight? You humiliated your mother. You made your sister cry. You disrespected this family again. The accusation hit me with the familiarity of an old bruise. He didn't say I refused to sign a fraudulent contract. He said I humiliated them. That was always the real crime. Ivy sniffled loudly behind him, though when I glanced her way, her eyes were dry. She hugged her arms to her chest like a victim in a movie, but her jaw kept twitching, annoyed more than devastated. Linda stepped forward, her voice rising for the audience of relatives gathered around the dining table. Crystal, your father is right. You can't leave until you accept responsibility. Ivy needs you. She needs her own job, someone muttered. A few relatives exchanged looks. Not everyone had chosen a side yet, but the cracks were forming. My father shifted, blocking the hallway completely. Sit down. Doan stepped up beside me. She's not sitting anywhere. She's leaving. The house felt too small, too hot, like every garland, every ornament, every blinking Christmas light was a set of eyes watching me suffocate. I just want my coat, I said. No, my father snapped. You're not walking out of here and pretending you didn't cause this. I didn't cause anything. My voice shook. I didn't lie. I didn't forge documents. I didn't live stream this mess. Trevor in the corner lifted his phone higher. Please don't say my name, he whispered. The comment thread on his screen was still rolling at dizzying speed. I caught glimpses as the messages flashed. Call the police. She needs to get out. Red flag family, this is abuse. My mother lunged toward him, but Uncle Ray grabbed her arm. Linda, stop. It's too late. Too late. She rounded on him wild-eyed. No, you don't get to say that. This family stays together. We fix things ourselves. We don't let strangers interfere. Strangers. She meant the live stream audience. She meant Doan. She meant anyone outside her control. But then she looked directly at me. And we certainly don't let Crystal run away from what she owes us. The room erupted with overlapping voices. Disbelief, anger, panic. But above it all came a sound I hadn't heard since childhood. Glass rattling. I had backed into the china cabinet without realizing it. My father had stepped closer, leaning in with enough force to make the shelves quiver. A porcelain dish slid forward, then another. Dad, I warned. Don't you take that tone with me, he snapped. I'm not trying to. But the sentence shattered with the cabinet as his arm jerked forward, hitting the wooden frame. The shelves trembled, then collapsed with a violent crash. China exploded across the floor like white shrapnel. A shard sliced across my palm. A hot sting followed, then warmth as blood welled up. My mother screamed, "Not for me! For the dishes!" "My wedding china!" she shrieked. "Look what you did! Look what you did now! I hadn't even touched the cabinet!" Doan reached for me. "Crystal, you're bleeding! Let's go!" But my father grabbed my uninjured arm, his grip locked like a clamp pinching muscle to bone. "You're not walking out, not until you pay what you owe." Pain shot up my arm. I gasped. Uncle Ray stepped forward. "Let her go. She's not leaving," my father said, voice thick with rage. "She'll sign. She'll transfer the money. She'll fix what she caused. I'm not signing anything," I cried. That was when my mother lost control. She lunged, grabbing my phone from Doan's hand and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall and cracked. "You've done enough damage," she screamed. "Enough, Mom, stop!" I tried to pull away from my father, but his grip tightened. Trevor's voice rose shakily from the corner. Guys, 12,000 people are watching now." My father froze. My mother's mouth dropped open. Ivy spun around toward Trevor like she could claw the phone from his hands, but he backed away. "It's not my fault," he said. "It auto-synced to TikTok Live. Comments are everywhere." The room went quiet except for the soft tapping of blood hitting the floor from my cut hand. Aunt Claire broke the silence. "Crystal, sweetheart, are you okay?" No one had asked me that all night. "I don't know," I whispered. She moved toward me, her face turning pale. "Let me see your arm." My father jerked me away from her. "She's fine. She's bleeding," Claire snapped. My head spun. My body felt too light, too heavy, too everything all at once. The live stream chat pinged loudly with a donation alert. Someone had sent money to Trevor's stream with the message, "Call the cops now." Doan stepped between me and my father, voice steady even though I could feel the tremor in him. "Let go of her, or I will make you." My father held my arm another second too long. Then slowly he released me. I stumbled back into Doan's arms, clutching the bleeding hand against my chest. The relatives parted instinctively, making a path to the door. No one tried to block me this time. Not because they agreed with me, because thousands of strangers were watching. And for the first time in my life, the truth wasn't trapped in this house with me. It was out there, visible, alive, impossible to bury. The path to the front door stayed open, but the room closed in around me in a different way, eyes tracking my every movement, breaths held like someone might break into another explosion at any second. I pressed a napkin against my bleeding palm, the pressure sharp enough to make my knees wobble. I just needed to get out, one step, then another. Simple. Except my mother wasn't done. "Mia," she barked, voice slicing through the air, "sit down. We're not finished." I kept walking. I didn't trust myself to speak. My father moved fast. Too fast. His arm shot out, blocking the doorway again. "You don't leave until you've fixed the mess you made." "I didn't make any mess," I whispered. My mother stepped closer, her expression a mixture of outrage and calculation. "If you walk out now, you're abandoning this family. You will not embarrass us in front of all these people. All these witnesses. That was the real problem." I steadied myself. "Move." He didn't. His bulk filled the entryway, his presence like a wall reinforced with decades of practiced intimidation. He wasn't yelling now. He didn't have to. His silence had always been worse. But I wasn't alone. Doan stepped half a pace forward, shoulders squared, ready to break through if he had to. And something about that willingness, his wordless refusal to let them cage me, strengthened the shaking parts of me. "I'm leaving," I said. My father's jaw twitched. "You think you get to decide that?" Before Doan could answer, a sudden commotion rippled from behind us. Gasps, scraping chairs. A sharp female voice yelling, "Hey, don't!" I turned just in time to see Ivy lunging across the room, hands outstretched not toward me, but toward Trevor. "Turn that off," she screamed. Trevor stumbled backward, clutching his phone to his chest. "Stop, Mom said to document. I said, turn it off." Ivy clawed for the device. He dodged her, backing into the Christmas tree. Ornaments rattled. One shattered against the floor. "Leave him alone," Aunt Claire shouted. Ivy spun around, hair flying, eyes burning. "You don't understand. This is going everywhere." "It already has," Uncle Ray said grimly. "Nothing we say or do now is private." The buzz of the live stream chat pinged again, an insistent humming reminder that thousands of strangers were witnessing every second. Doan used the distraction to pull me a few steps closer to the door, but my father pivoted, blocking us again. "Dad," I begged. "Please." "No," he said coldly. "You're not running from this." Something cracked, not in the room but inside me. The realization that he wasn't trying to keep me safe. He wasn't trying to resolve the situation. He was trying to trap me. "Mia," he said, voice tightening. "Sit down before you make this worse." I didn't move. My mother crossed her arms. "You're acting unstable. Look at you crying, bleeding hysterical." Claire scoffed. "She's bleeding because your husband shoved her into a cabinet." But my mother ignored her eyes, never leaving mine. "You need to calm down before you make a decision you'll regret." There it was. Not concern, strategy. Behind me, Trevor whispered urgently. Mia, the comments say someone is calling the police." Good, I thought. Terrifying, my mother must have thought, because her mask shattered. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a force that stole my breath. "You're not going anywhere," she screamed. Her nails dug through my sleeve. Pain shot up my arm. I tried to pull free, but her grip only tightened. Doan grabbed her wrist. "Let go of her." My father stepped in instantly. "Get your hands off my wife." Ray jumped between them. "Enough. Do you hear yourselves? There are 17 people in this house, and you're assaulting your daughter in front of all of them." "Assault," my mother spat. "She's dramatic. Always has been." I yanked my arm back hard enough to break her hold. The motion sent a jolt through my wounded hand, and fresh blood seeped through the napkin. Trevor whimpered. "Guys, this is still streaming." A chorus of notifications chimed. My phone, wherever it had landed, buzzed relentlessly from someone's texts or missed calls. Then abruptly a calmer voice cut through the chaos. "Crystal." Aunt Meredith stepped forward, eyes lowered, hands shaking. "There's something else." My mother whirled on her. "Don't!" Meredith ignored her. She pulled a thick, sealed envelope from her coat pocket, the same one from earlier, but this time with quiet resignation instead of guilt. She held it out to me again. I didn't know what was in it before she whispered. "But I do now." My mother lunged. Give that to me. Ray intercepted her again. Sit down, Linda. I stared at the envelope, at the weight she seemed to feel holding it. What's in there? Meredith's voice trembled. Proof that this wasn't about rent. It never was. The room held its breath. She gestured to the shattered china, the streaming phone, the blood staining my napkin, the contract on the table. All of this, she said softly, heartbreakingly, was designed to get your signature. My mother's face twisted. Ivy's mask cracked into something raw and furious. My father's fists flexed at his sides. And for the first time I realized I hadn't interrupted a family dinner. I had stepped into a coordinated trap. I wasn't the hysterical one. I was the target. And now, thanks to a trembling aunt with a guilty conscience and a bravery she'd never shown before, the truth was finally surfacing piece by devastating piece. I took the envelope from Aunt Meredith with hands that weren't steady enough to hide the fear clawing through me. The paper was warm from her palm, soft at the edges as if she'd been squeezing it for courage. My mother's sharp inhale split the room like a threat. Crystal, she warned, do not open that. Her voice had changed, no longer furious, but frightened. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I slipped my finger under the seal. Ivy surged forward. Crystal, seriously, don't. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Doan stepped between us, blocking her. She can open whatever she wants. My father muttered something under his breath, fists clenching and unclenching as if he were deciding whether he could snatch the envelope from my hands without an audience of nearly 15,000 live-stream viewers condemning him for it. I unfolded the documents. Lines of dense text filled the pages. Legal language numbered clauses, interest rates, repayment penalties. But my gaze locked on one sentence near the top: transfer of full financial liability to Mia Thompson. Guarantor, Mia Thompson. There was more. Paragraph after paragraph detailing an outstanding loan far larger than anything Ivy had ever mentioned. 5 figures. Ballooning interest. And at the bottom, a signature line already stamped with my printed name. My printed name. But not my signature. My mother spoke first, desperate now. Mia, we only wanted to protect you. I looked up. By assigning me to a debt I didn't create? Ivy scoffed, arms crossed. It's not even a real debt. It's just a temporary arrangement until I get back on my feet. Then why is the amount almost $30,000, I asked. She blinked, then stammered. It's complicated. Ray stepped closer, peering over my shoulder. This isn't a regular loan. Look at the lender. He pointed to the header, some generic corporate name. No address, no phone number. Doan read it too. This is a shell company. This looks like predatory lending. My mother bristled. It's perfectly legitimate. Then why did you hide it from me? I asked quietly. Ivy threw her hands up. Because you always run away from responsibility. I needed help. You needed signatures, I corrected. My signature, my father growled. Since when is helping your sister a crime? When it's fraud, Doan answered. The room recoiled as if he'd slapped someone. I flipped to the next page. Something fell out. A smaller folded note, scribbled handwriting on the back of a receipt. I recognized Ivy's handwriting instantly. Mom said she'll crack if we push hard. Dad agrees. Crystal will sign if she feels guilty enough. My breath left my body. A cold, hollow ache replaced it. I looked at Ivy, hoping some foolish, naive part of me that she'd deny it. She didn't. She straightened her shoulders. You weren't supposed to see that. You weren't supposed to record her, Linda snapped at Trevor. Trevor's cheeks flushed. I was told to. You said, but no one listened. Everyone was spiraling. I kept scanning the stack, flipping page after page. One document listed Ivy's expenses, not rent, not groceries, but luxury purchases. Salon appointments, designer bags, weekend trips. And then farther down the sheet, a line item labeled Lease Secondary Unit. My jaw tightened. You have a second apartment. Ivy's mouth twitched. It's not like that. What is it like then? I asked. Because you told everyone you were broke. You told me you were days from eviction. Linda jumped in. She didn't want to admit she failed. She didn't fail, I said, lifting the document. She lied. Aunt Claire gasped. Uncle Ray swore under his breath. A cousin whispered, "Oh my God!" Ivy's face flushed scarlet. You don't understand anything. That apartment is for emergencies, storage, privacy. You're blowing everything up for no reason. No reason, I repeated. You tried to trick me into being legally responsible for your debt. She snapped. You make more money than me. Doan stepped closer to her. She makes enough to live, not enough to cover your lies. I saw something crumble in Ivy's expression, something that had nothing to do with guilt. Fear. Real, genuine fear. And it wasn't directed at me. She darted a glance toward the hallway, toward the entrance, toward the world outside the live stream. Someone watching, someone waiting, someone expecting results. But before I could process the look in her eyes, the room erupted again. Linda lunged, trying to rip the documents from my hands. Doan intercepted her. Ray grabbed Gerald's arm as he tried to push toward me. A dozen relatives shouted over one another. And in the chaos, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A familiar worn key dangling from Ivy's purse. Not a house key, not a car key. A key to an apartment complex downtown, the same complex where luxury units weren't just expensive, they were exclusive. You've been hiding a whole other life, I said, pointing at the key. Rent designer things, secret apartments, all paid with money you didn't have, and money they wanted from me. The truth hit her like a blow. For once, Ivy didn't speak. Ray cleared his throat. There's more going on here. This isn't just bad budgeting. Someone else is involved. Everyone paused. Doan picked up the contract again. This loan predates Ivy's supposed financial troubles. Somebody prepared this long before tonight. My mother hissed, "Stop digging." But it was too late. I could feel the shape of the trap now clearer with every passing second. Something bigger than Ivy's lies. Something that required my signature, my clean financial history to stay afloat. I folded the documents and set them on the table. I'm not signing, I said again, calmer this time. Firmer, unshakable. My father glared. Ivy trembled. Linda paled. Ray exhaled like someone realizing the house they lived in had been built on explosives. Aunt Meredith whispered, voice-cracking Mia, "They weren't just pressuring you." She nodded at the papers. They were preparing you. And the room, for the first time all night, fell into a dead, choking silence. I took a step back from the table, trying to steady my breath, but the edges of my vision were already narrowing. The room felt wrong, tilted too bright, too loud. My mother's voice blended with the buzzing lights overhead until everything sounded distant, like I was underwater. "Mia, stop being dramatic," she snapped. "You're not going anywhere until this is resolved." But my legs were already moving, or trying to. I reached for the hallway wall, fingertips brushing the paint as the whole house swayed like a ship I couldn't balance on. Doan was beside me in an instant. Hey, look at me," Mia breathed. "I'm fine." I lied. I wasn't fine. The room spun so violently I couldn't tell where the floor ended and the walls began. My stomach flipped. The napkin around my bleeding hand felt hot, soaked through. My father's voice thundered from behind us. "She's not leaving." I turned toward the door, but the world went white at the edges, then gray. Mia Doan's voice echoed. My mother's voice cut in sharp and cold. "Well, if she passes out, that's even better. It proves she's unstable." Those were the last words I heard before everything tilted backward. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, I smelled antiseptic. Not turkey, not pine candles, not the sour tension of a house full of secrets. Just sterile hospital air, humming machines, and a ceiling tile with a crack shaped like a lightning bolt. Mia, a nurse, said gently, "You're awake." My throat tightened. "Where?" "You fainted," she replied, adjusting the IV taped to my arm. "Severe stress response and dehydration." Ethan was there too, standing at the foot of the bed, shoulders hunched like he'd been holding up the world for hours. When he saw my eyes open, relief washed over his face in a wave so raw it almost broke me. "You scared the hell out of me," he said softly, sitting beside me. "They said your blood pressure spiked." I thought I reached for him, wincing at the tug of the IV. "How did I get here?" His jaw tightened. "An ambulance. Someone watching the live stream called 911. I closed my eyes. The live stream, the entire internet witnessing the moment my body finally gave out. "Your parents?" Ethan continued, voice strained, "were yelling at the EMTs when they tried to get you out of the house. Gerald even tried to take your phone while you were unconscious." I blinked. "What I saw him," Ethan said. "He was scrolling through your banking app." A cold rush slid through me, numbing everything. They were still trying to force the transfer, even then. The nurse glanced toward the door, lowered her voice, and leaned slightly closer. "We saw your sister last week." My eyes flew open. "What?" "She came in with a man," she said gently. "She was requesting a stress evaluation. But the way they talked, it seemed like she wanted documentation for something. Not treatment." Ethan and I exchanged a sharp look. "A man?" Ethan asked. "Tall brown jacket." The nurse nodded. "Yes. He kept talking about proof and records. Honestly, it didn't seem medical." Ivy. The mysterious man. The forged documents. The pressure to sign. Every piece slid closer together in my mind, forming a shape I didn't want to see. "Was Ivy okay?" I asked quietly. The nurse hesitated. She looked irritated. "Not distressed." Of course she did. After the nurse left, Ethan leaned closer. "Mia, it gets worse." My heart stuttered. "What now?" He pulled up his phone and played a voicemail. A low, distorted male voice said, "Walk away. Stop digging. She signs or she pays in other ways." My skin went cold. "That came in an hour ago," Ethan said, "from a blocked number." Before I could respond, a police officer stepped into the room. "Ms. Thompson, I need to take a statement." My pulse spiked, but Ethan squeezed my hand. "I'm here." The officer explained they'd received an anonymous report accusing me of attacking my parents before collapsing. My stomach dropped. Of course. They were trying to frame me already, setting the groundwork for an involuntary evaluation. Officer Ethan said firmly, "She didn't attack anyone. There's live stream footage of the entire night." The officer nodded. "We're aware, and that live stream likely saved you." His words felt heavy. He continued, "Whoever created that financial liability contract was not acting lawfully. If someone is trying this hard to get your signature, Ms. Thompson, there's almost always fraud involved, and if they're hinting you're unstable, that's a coercive tactic." I swallowed hard. What should I do? "Don't return to that house," he said. "Document everything, and get legal representation immediately." He took my statement, reassured me again, and stepped out. When he did, the nurse returned to remove the IV. But before she left, she paused, looking uneasy. "There's something else," she said softly. "Your sister asked us something the night she came in." I braced myself. She wanted to know if a family could request a psychiatric hold for someone without their consent. My lungs collapsed inward. She didn't say who she meant, the nurse added, but she looked nervous. "I thought you should know." She handed me a folded note Ivy apparently left behind during her visit. I opened it with trembling fingers. 3 phrases written in rushed handwriting. "She's unpredictable. Danger to herself. Get her evaluated first." My stomach twisted so violently I had to grip the bed. Ethan whispered, "Mia." She was preparing this long before tonight. I nodded, tears burning behind my eyes. This hadn't been a meltdown. This had been a blueprint. "Mia," Ethan said gently, lifting my chin. "You're coming home with me. You're not facing this alone." I stared at the note in my hand, at the blood-stained gauze on my palm, at the bruises already blooming along my arm. If they were willing to institutionalize me to secure my signature, what were they planning next? The question sat in my chest like a stone as Ethan helped me into his coat and guided me out of the hospital. I didn't know the answer, but I knew this whatever they'd started wasn't over. And I wasn't going back. I barely slept at Ethan's apartment that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the hospital lights dissolved into my mother's voice, my father's shadow, Ivy's angry whisper. When morning finally seeped through the blinds, it felt thin and watery, as if even the sun didn't want to push too hard on my life right now. Ethan was already up making coffee with hands that looked steadier than the rest of him. When he turned, worry flickered across his face. "I called the legal aid center. Someone named Marion Hale can meet us in an hour." "I don't know if I'm ready," I said. He set the mug in front of me. "Not being ready is exactly why we need help." By the time Marion arrived, I'd wrapped my trembling fingers around the hot coffee so many times I couldn't feel the warmth anymore. She was older. Silver hair pulled into a neat twist, glasses perched at the end of her nose, posture straight enough to suggest she'd spent decades telling powerful men they were wrong. She shook my hand gently. "Mia, I'm here to help. Ethan gave me an outline, but I need to hear it from you." So I told her everything. From the first slap at Christmas dinner to the live stream to the contract they tried to force me to sign to the hospital nurse telling me Ivy had asked about involuntary psychiatric holds. Marion didn't interrupt. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "This is not a family disagreement," she said. "This is a coordinated attempt at financial coercion." I nodded numbly. Then she added something that made my breath stop. "And I knew your grandmother." My head jerked up. "You knew Eleanor, I did." Marion folded her hands. She consulted me years ago, worried about certain family members trying to pressure her into changes she didn't want to make. I felt dizzy again, but not from fear this time. From recognition. From a realization that maybe I wasn't imagining all of this. "What did she say about them?" I asked. "That some people mistake kindness for opportunity," Marion said carefully. "And that you," she paused, her expression softening, "were the one she trusted to see through lies." My throat tightened. I hadn't felt worthy of that kind of faith in a long time. Marion pulled a thin folder from her bag. "Last night after Ethan called, I checked your grandmother's probate records. Something concerned me." She placed the file on the table and opened it. I leaned in. The will looked familiar. Until it didn't. One amendment page was written in handwriting that didn't match Eleanor's. Ink darker. Pressure inconsistent. A date written in a slightly different slant. "Someone added your sister's name," Marion explained. "In a different pen." My stomach dropped. "Who, I don't know yet," she said. "But the larger question is why." We continued reviewing documents until Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. He hesitated, then put it on speaker. A distorted male voice said, "Stop digging. This is bigger than Ivy." Then the line went dead. Silence clamped down like a vice. Marion straightened her glasses. "Well, that confirms someone outside your family is involved." I stared at the phone. "What does that mean?" "It means," Marion replied calmly, "you are not dealing with a simple lie but a network of interests. And your signature may be their ticket to cleaning up something much larger. The room felt colder. Before any of us could speak again, there was a frantic knock at the door, 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 2 more. Not violent, but desperate. Ethan approached cautiously. "Who is it?" a muffled voice answered. "It's Meredith." Aunt Meredith's silhouette trembled behind the frosted glass. Ethan opened the door just enough for her to slip inside. She looked nothing like she had last night, her hair disheveled, her eyes red, her coat thrown over pajamas like she had fled her house. She pressed her back to the closed door, panting. "I think someone followed me." My pulse spiked. "What? Who would be following you?" She shook her head. "Not sure. But they were parked outside my house, engine running. When I came out, they pulled away slowly. Not like a neighbor, like someone watching." Ethan locked the door. Marion stood and faced Meredith. "Tell us everything." Meredith wrung her hands. "I didn't want to get involved, I swear. But after last night, Crystal, I couldn't sleep. Mia." I corrected automatically in my head. I had spent so long being what everyone else wanted, I barely remembered being myself. Meredith took a shuddering breath. "There's something you don't know. Something none of us were supposed to tell you." I felt Ethan shift behind me, a steady presence. Mia Meredith whispered it wasn't Ivy who asked for your name on that contract. It wasn't her idea to put you on the hook for the debt. My skin prickled. "Then who?" Meredith's lips pressed into a tight line before she whispered the name Henry. I blinked. "Uncle Henry." "He told Ivy it was necessary. He told your parents you'd be manageable. He convinced them he could fix everything if you just signed." The room spun more violently than it had the night before, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from betrayal. Henry had always been the quiet one, the calm one. The one who brought me books as a kid, told me to stay in school, told me I was smart. He had also been present at the reading of Eleanor's will, and he had the most to gain from altering it. Marion closed her folder slowly. "That means this goes far deeper than we thought." Ethan put a hand on my shoulder. "We're going to find out what he's hiding." Meredith nodded frantically. "There's more. I can show you, but you need to come with me, before someone else realizes I've talked." I stared at her trembling hands, at Marion's steady eyes, at Ethan's protective stance. This wasn't about rent. This wasn't about Ivy's irresponsibility. This wasn't even about my parents' manipulation. This was a coordinated plan, a network, a trap. And someone I once trusted was at the center of it. "Okay," I said finally, "show me." Because the only thing more terrifying than uncovering the truth was letting them hide it any longer. Aunt Meredith didn't speak again until we were in Ethan's car. Doors locked, engine running, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse so tightly the leather creaked. She kept glancing into the side mirror like she expected someone to appear behind us. "Just drive," she whispered. "Please." Ethan didn't ask questions. He pulled away from the curb, and only when we'd turned into a different neighborhood did Meredith finally exhale. "Ivy wasn't acting alone," she said, voice shaking. "She's been hiding things for months, maybe longer." I stared at her profile. "You said Henry was involved." "He is," she said quickly. "But you need to understand how deeply Ivy was pulled into all this." Her purse trembled in her lap as she unzipped it and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a screenshot printed from a private social media account. She handed it to me. My stomach dropped. It was Ivy. Not the Ivy who sat at our parents' kitchen table looking helpless and needy, but a version of her dressed in designer clothes, hair styled flawlessly, posed inside a luxury apartment with city skyline windows behind her. Several more photos followed, a brand new SUV, a weekend beach trip, a necklace that cost more than my monthly mortgage. A man standing half hidden beside her face turned away. "That's not possible," I whispered. "She said she couldn't afford groceries." Meredith's mouth twisted. "She told everyone a lot of things." Doan leaned forward from the driver's seat. Where was this posted on a private account under an alias? Meredith said. I only found it because one of her friends thought it was strange Ivy had 2 profiles. I flipped through the images, anger rising beneath my skin. My parents made me feel selfish for not paying her rent, I said. And she was living like this. Meredith nodded miserably. Ethan cleared his throat. Where exactly are we going to the place Ivy didn't want anyone to know about? Meredith said. The second apartment. A chill ran through me. We followed the location pin from an old family safety app synced to Ivy's phone, one she'd apparently forgotten I still had access to. The route led us downtown toward gleaming windows and guarded entrances. As we pulled into the parking lot of a sleek apartment complex with polished steel balconies and a lobby that probably cost more than my entire house to furnish, Meredith pointed to a side entrance. She uses that one, she said. Less visible. We stepped inside, following her down a hallway, smelling faintly of expensive candles and industrial cleaner. Every step felt like peeling back the layers of a lie I'd been breathing in for years. Meredith stopped at a small storage alcove and lifted the latch. Inside was a metal locker. She keeps things here, Meredith whispered. I've seen her come down with folders. Doan helped open it. What spilled out made my heart race. A notebook. Bank statements under Ivy's alias. Receipts for wire transfers to an unknown name. Printed screenshots of cryptocurrency transactions. A keycard for the building. And in the back, a folder labeled with a single initial M. My hands trembled as I opened it. Ledger pages. Rows of numbers. Initials. Amounts. Check marks. Dates. Under one tab, my own initials appeared, MT. What is this? I breathed. Marion took the pages, gently scanning them with growing alarm. This looks like a small-scale fraud ledger. Somebody was tracking funds moved through different aliases. Meredith covered her mouth. I didn't know it was this bad. I swear I didn't. Before I could respond, a voice echoed from above. You shouldn't be here. We all turned. A man stood on the landing of the metal staircase, tall, dark jacket, same build as the one the hospital nurse had described, his expression twisted into a knowing smirk. Sheer dread spearheaded through me. He descended the steps slowly, hands casually in his pockets. Ivy said you'd sign by now, he said. She promised. Ethan stepped forward. Don't come closer. The man cocked his head. Relax. Nobody wants trouble. We just want the agreement finalized. What agreement, I asked, though I already knew. The one that transfers liability. He smiled. You're the clean one, the safe one. Mia Thompson makes everything convenient. Convenient. For laundering, for covering tracks, for cleaning debts Ivy never intended to pay on her own. Who are you? Marion asked sharply. He shrugged. Someone with an interest in making sure Ivy delivers what she promised. And what was that, I asked, choking on the words. Your cooperation, of course. Doan reached for his phone, but the man lifted a finger. I wouldn't call anyone. Not unless you want Ivy's situation to get a lot worse. My stomach twisted. What situation? He smiled again, crueler this time. Debt is debt. Someone pays one way or another. Meredith let out a thin, horrified sound. Marion stepped between me and the man. We're leaving. He backed up the steps, still smirking. Suit yourselves. But time isn't on your side. He disappeared through a door on the upper level. Silence stretched for several seconds before my legs remembered how to move. We need to go, Ethan said. Now. As we hurried back toward the car, Meredith grabbed my arm. Mia, I didn't tell you everything. My heart pounded. What more could there be? She swallowed hard, eyes glistening. Henry wasn't just helping Ivy. He wasn't just helping your parents. He was working with them. With who, I whispered. The words stuck in her throat, but when she forced it out, my entire world felt like it dropped through the floor. People who wanted your grandmother's estate. People who needed your name. She shuddered. This was never just Ivy's mess. It was a coordinated plan. And you were the piece they needed most. My breath hitched. My vision blurred. Whatever I thought I understood, I'd barely scratched the surface, and I knew now the real enemy wasn't Ivy. It wasn't even my parents. The danger went deeper, and it was coming for me next. Henry opened the door before we even reached the porch, as if he'd been standing behind it waiting for the sound of our footsteps. He filled the frame with a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that had always unsettled me even when I was too young to understand why. "Well," he drawled, eyes flicking from me to Meredith to Marion, and finally to Ethan, "I didn't expect a whole audience." "Come in." He stepped aside. Nobody moved. His smile sharpened. "What's wrong? Afraid I'll bite?" Meredith's voice trembled. "Henry, they know." Silence fell heavy and thick as he closed the door behind us without waiting for permission. The air inside the house smelled like citrus cleaner and burnt coffee, sterile, unnatural, the opposite of how Uncle Henry's home used to feel. He walked past us toward the living room where stacks of paper and folders were spread across the coffee table like someone had been working through the night, or shredding evidence. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the couch. "If you're going to accuse me of something, at least do it comfortably." "We're not accusing," Marion said evenly. "We're confirming." Henry lifted a brow. "Is that so?" I stepped forward, clutching the folder we'd found in Ivy's locker. "Why is my name all over this?" His expression flickered just a fraction, but I saw it. Recognition. Calculation. Annoyance. More than enough. He sank into his armchair, crossed one leg over the other, and studied me like a puzzle he'd grown tired of assembling. "Mia," he said softly, "if you're going to look through things that don't belong to you, you should at least learn how to interpret them." "They were hidden," I said. "Hidden from everyone, including me. Because you weren't ready." He said it casually, like someone explaining why they didn't let their child use the stove. I felt my fingernails dig into my palms. "What exactly did you think I wasn't ready for?" I asked. Henry gestured to the mountain of paperwork. "Responsibility, legacy, the weight of decisions your grandmother left behind." A bitter laugh escaped me. "My grandmother left me nothing but memories." "That's the funny thing about memories," he said gently. "They tend to rewrite themselves." Marion stepped closer. "Enough riddles. We know about the modified amendment. We know Ivy was pressured. We know someone stood to gain if Mia was legally attached to the estate." Henry tilted his head. "Estate is a generous word for what Eleanor hid." My breath froze. "What?" "She hid." Henry steepled his fingers. "You didn't really think that woman lived modestly out of necessity, did you?" Ethan tensed beside me. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. Henry leaned back, watching my reaction with unsettling enjoyment. "Your grandmother," he said slowly, "was worth far more than anybody realized. Stocks, land, dividends. All tucked away. All invisible. Until now." No one breathed. "And I was the one managing those invisible parts," he continued casually. "Quietly. Efficiently. For decades." My heart pounded so loud I felt it in my teeth. "Then she died," he said. "And suddenly, the legal protections she put in place unraveled earlier than expected." "What protections?" Marion asked. "One's designed to prevent this exact moment," Henry replied. "Eleanor knew your parents would cannibalize any scrap of money they touched. She knew Ivy would fold. She knew you were the only one she trusted." He paused. "But trust doesn't always equal readiness." I swallowed. Readiness for what Henry's eyes softened almost sympathetically. To be the heir. Nothing in the room moved. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed to pause. Marion recovered first. If that were true, the amendment wouldn't have been altered. Henry smiled. Exactly. Someone didn't want Mia in control. Someone wanted access. Someone desperate. He tapped the ledger in my hands. So they tried to reroute everything under a liability agreement, one that would make Mia the legal fall person if anything went wrong. Ethan stepped forward. And who orchestrated that? Henry shrugged. You found the ledger. You tell me. Ivy, I whispered. And your parents, he added. Not you, I asked. His lips twitched. I don't need to steal what is already mine, Mia. A quiet horror slipped through my chest. What do you mean? He rose from the chair, slowly walked to the fireplace, and retrieved a locked metal box from behind a stack of books. He set it on the table, turned the key, and opened it. Inside was a single envelope, my name written in my grandmother's handwriting across the front. My breath hitched. He slid it toward me. She wrote that 6 months before she died. She trusted me to deliver it when you were ready. My fingers trembled as I lifted it, breaking the seal. Inside was a brief handwritten note. Mia, if you're reading this, then the people you love have already revealed their true selves. You are the rightful steward of everything I could not protect. Do not let them take what was never theirs. E. I closed my eyes as emotion flushed hot and overwhelming through me. Henry sighed. She wasn't perfect, but she chose you. And others resented that. Marion's eyes narrowed. If you were really working in Mia's best interest, why didn't you intervene sooner? Henry's jaw tightened. Because I didn't realize how quickly Ivy would fold or how reckless your parents would become. I assumed they'd try to manipulate her, but the violence. The contract that wasn't part of the plan. The man in the apartment complex, I whispered. Who is he? Henry hesitated. Then for the first time since we'd entered the house, his confidence cracked. He's someone your parents involved, he said quietly. Someone who shouldn't have been involved at all. They opened a door that cannot be easily closed. I felt the room tilt. Why would they do that? I asked. Henry stared at me, eyes full of something weighty and unspoken. To erase a problem, he said. And the problem was you. I felt the air leave my lungs. Ethan reached for my hand. We're done here. But Henry shook his head. No, you're not. Because whether you believe me or not, you're in danger now more than you understand. I forced myself to meet his eyes. Why would I ever trust you? Because he said softly, I'm the only one who knows who they hired. A cold tremor ran through me. And Mia, they didn't hire him to scare you. His next words nearly buckled my knees. They hired him to eliminate you. The room went silent. Henry looked at me with something like regret. And now that you've started uncovering things, he won't stop. I didn't remember leaving Henry's house. One moment I was staring at him, my grandmother's letter still burning in my hands, and the next I was in the back seat of Ethan's car, streetlights streaking across the windows as we drove in silence. No one spoke. Even breathing felt too loud. It wasn't until we reached Ethan's apartment garage that my legs finally gave out. He caught me before I hit the pavement, guiding me upstairs while Marion and Meredith followed closely behind. Inside, he locked all 3 deadbolts. Then he turned to me with a haunted expression. They hired someone, he said softly. Your own parents. Hearing it again didn't make it any more real. Or any less. I sank onto the couch. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Marion paced the living room, muttering under her breath as she mentally sorted through legal statutes. This is beyond coercion. This is criminal conspiracy, fraud, attempted harm. If Henry's telling the truth, he lied about plenty before Ethan snapped. Why believe him now? Marion stopped pacing. Because it fits. Too perfectly. Meredith spoke next, voice fragile. There's something else I should tell you. I closed my eyes. I didn't think I could take more, but she forced the words out anyway. Your parents, they took out a life insurance policy. On you. The room went dead still. My heartbeat roared in my ears. What I whispered. Meredith flinched. I saw the paperwork months ago when your mother asked me to be a witness. I didn't understand it at the time. But now it makes sense. My throat tightened until I could barely breathe. How much? A high-value plan, she whispered. 600,000. The kind of money people kill for. The kind of money desperate people, cornered people, would justify 1,000 ways. Ethan sank into an armchair, stunned. Jesus, Mia. My voice cracked. Why wouldn't she tell me? Marian folded her arms. Because the beneficiary wasn't you. I didn't ask who. I already knew. My sister, I said hollowly. Or my father. Both names tasted like betrayal. A violent trembling ripped through me from head to toe. I curled into myself, hugging my knees, fighting the urge to scream. Ethan knelt beside me. They won't touch you. Not now. Not ever. But reassurance couldn't erase the truth. My parents didn't just want my signature, they wanted my disappearance. Marian took a steadying breath. We need protection. Starting now. Ethan nodded. I'll call Detective Ramirez. But as he reached for his phone, it buzzed in his hand, an incoming call from an unknown number. He froze. Don't answer, Marian warned. But the voicemail came through seconds later. A distorted voice played through the speaker. You should have signed. Time's running out. The message cut off. My blood felt like ice. Meredith stumbled backward, covering her mouth. This is my fault. I should have told you sooner. I should have. It's not your fault, I murmured, but even I didn't sound convinced. Marian grabbed her coat. We're going to the police station. All of us. Tonight. She wasn't asking. She was commanding. And at that moment, I was grateful someone still knew how to stand upright when the ground collapsed. Ethan helped me to my feet, but my body felt disconnected, like I was watching myself from somewhere far away. We headed for the door, but the hallway outside was pitch black. The building normally kept the lights dim at night, but this darkness felt deliberate, calculated. Ethan stepped out first, checking both directions. Stay behind me. We moved quickly down the hall, listening for any sound, breathing, footsteps, movement, but there was nothing except the faint hum of the elevator machinery. I hugged my arms around myself. I just want this to stop. Ethan reached for the elevator button, but the moment he pressed it, the stairwell door at the opposite end of the hall swung open. A figure stepped out. Tall, dark jacket, same silhouette from the apartment complex. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched us. My breath caught in my throat. Meredith gasped. Marian pulled out her phone. Ethan stepped directly in front of me, shoulders squared. Then the elevator dinged behind us. The figure took one step forward. Marian hissed, "Go! Now!" We practically dove into the elevator. Ethan smashed the closed-door button over and over. The man didn't run, but he walked faster, closing the distance in long strides. Just before he reached the door, it sealed shut. The elevator lurched downward. I pressed myself against the wall, shaking uncontrollably. "What does he want?" Meredith whispered. Marian answered grimly, "Not a conversation." When we reached the lobby, Detective Ramirez himself was waiting, arms crossed, badge visible, expression stern. He must have heard the voicemail, or maybe one of the automatic alerts from Ethan's earlier messages had gone through. "Ms. Thompson," he said, stepping forward. "We need to get you somewhere safe immediately." But before we could respond, a receptionist called from behind the desk. "Detective, someone just left an envelope for Mia Thompson." The three of us froze as she held it out. My name written on the front. Black ink. Sharp strokes. Precise. Too precise. I didn't take it. I couldn't. Detective Ramirez did. He opened it with gloved hands and pulled out a single sheet of paper. His face went rigid. "What does it say?" I whispered. He looked at me, eyes full of warning. It says you're already out of time. The lobby spun around me. Ethan reached for me, but all I could hear was Henry's voice echoing from earlier. They didn't hire him to scare you. They hired him to eliminate you, and the terrifying truth cracked open inside me. He wasn't done. Detective Ramirez didn't waste a second. He guided us through a secured hallway behind the lobby, past locked doors and frosted windows, into a small emergency interview room. The moment the door shut, the lock clicked, sealing us inside. "You're under police protection now," he said, leveling his gaze at me. Someone escalated. We respond accordingly. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest felt tight cold from the inside out. Ethan moved closer, his hand wrapping around mine, grounding me. Marion and Meredith sat across the table, both pale, both shaken. Detective Ramirez set the threatening note on the table. "We'll dust for prints, but someone this careful won't leave many." Marion leaned forward. "Detective, we're dealing with more than family coercion. There's a man, an enforcer of some kind. He confronted us. He implied Ivy owes money to a dangerous party." Ramirez nodded. "I've seen this before. Someone's gambling debt or private loan gone wrong. But what I need to know," he turned back to me, "is whether you're willing to file a formal statement." I swallowed. The word statement felt like a point of no return, but so was everything else. "Yes," I whispered. "I will." He clicked his pen. "Start from the beginning." So I told him everything. The Christmas dinner, the live stream, the hospital threats, the shadowy man, Henry's confession, the ledger, the fake rent, the life insurance policy. The contract meant to trap me. Every detail, every fear, every moment that made my skin crawl. By the time I finished, the detective's hand had stilled above his notepad. "This," he said slowly, "is bigger than a domestic dispute." "We know," Ethan said. "No," Ramirez continued, leaning back, "bigger than fraud, bigger than intimidation. We're dealing with a conspiracy built on financial deception and inheritance disputes, and someone external willing to enforce it." His gaze hardened. "But your uncle? He complicates the picture." Meredith hugged herself. "Henry's been acting off for months, secretive, controlling. But I swear he wasn't always like this." Ramirez folded his arms. "In my experience, anyone sitting this close to the money eventually shows their true colors." I tensed. "But he warned us." "Did he?" the detective asked quietly. "Or did he frame the story in a way that made him look innocent?" The room went still. "People like him." Ramirez continued to survive by manipulating the narrative. "You can't assume he's on your side." I wanted to argue, but then I remembered the flicker in Henry's eyes, the way he enjoyed holding pieces of the truth like cards he could reveal or hide. Before we could respond, there was a knock. A young officer slipped inside, whispering something into Ramirez's ear. His expression changed instantly. He stood. "We're moving locations." My stomach dipped. "Why? What happened?" The officer glanced nervously between us. "Someone attempted to access the precinct lobby, asking for your name. Ms. Thompson." Ice shot through me. Ethan stepped protectively in front of me. "Did he get inside?" "No," the officer said. "He left when we approached." Ramirez motioned for us to stand. "You're being transferred to a safe house we use for high-risk victims." Meredith's voice trembled. "Is it that serious?" "Yes," Ramirez said. "Someone is actively tracking Mia, and they're getting bolder." He led us out through a restricted exit down a stairwell that opened into an underground garage. A black SUV idled there, engine humming, back doors open. "Get in," Ramirez instructed. We climbed inside. Ethan slid in next to me. Marion and Meredith took the rear seat. Ramirez got into the passenger seat while another officer took the wheel. As the SUV pulled out into the night, the city lights blurred into smears of gold and red. For the first time, I truly realized that I couldn't go home. I didn't have the luxury of returning to my life yet. Not until this was over. Not until they were caught. My voice felt small. "Detective, what happens to Ivy now?" "That depends on what she knows he said, and what she's willing to admit." "Can you protect her too?" I asked quietly. He studied me for a moment. "You still worry about her despite everything." "She's my sister," I whispered, "even if she helped them hurt me." He nodded slowly. "If she comes forward, we'll keep her safe." The SUV wound through side streets and back roads until we pulled into a dim parking garage beside a nondescript building. Inside was a modest, furnished apartment, simple, clean, tucked away behind reinforced doors. "This is temporary," Ramirez said. "We're gathering warrants for multiple arrests, but we need more leverage, something that ties all parties together." Marion stepped forward. "We have the ledger. Isn't that enough?" "It's helpful," he said, "but we need motive and connection. Proof that Ivy's debt, your parents' motives, and the hired enforcer are all linked." He turned to me. "And that trail goes through one person." My chest tightened. "Henry." "Yes," Ramirez said. "He's the common thread. Your grandmother trusted him. Your parents trusted him. Ivy trusted him. Everyone gave him access. And he was the one who knew about the hidden estate." Ethan muttered a curse under his breath. Ramirez continued. "If we can get into his home office, we might find the missing pieces." "But that requires a warrant," Marion said. "And probable cause," Ramirez finished, "which we're building fast." I sat down on the edge of the safe house couch, staring at my hands. Bruised, bandaged, trembling. "How long until they get desperate?" I whispered. Ramirez didn't sugarcoat it. "They already are." A soft knock interrupted us all. The kind of knock that didn't belong in a reinforced safe house. Slow, measured. 3 taps. Silence. 2 more taps. My entire body froze. Ethan reached for me, pulling me behind him. Ramirez drew his weapon, motioning everyone back. He approached the peephole, hesitated, then looked. His entire face changed. He opened the door. My breath stopped when I saw who stood on the other side. Ivy. Eyes red, lip trembling, hands shaking. She staggered inside before he even finished opening the door. "I can't go home," she whispered. "I can't go anywhere." Her eyes lifted to mine, wide with terror. "He knows I talked to you," she choked out. "He knows. He's coming." And then she said the words that made my knees buckle. "They don't want to hurt just you anymore. They want all of us gone." Ivy collapsed onto the nearest chair, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. I'd never seen her like this, not angry, not defensive, not manipulative, terrified. Truly bone-deep terrified. Detective Ramirez motioned for the door to be sealed again, then crouched in front of her. "Take your time. Tell us exactly what happened." She shook her head violently. "You don't understand. He came to the house. Mom and Dad let him in. They were arguing about me talking about you, about how everything is falling apart. And then he said..." Her voice cracked. "He said if they delivered us, he'd make their problem disappear." My stomach twisted. "Delivered us, all of us," Ivy whispered. "Not just you anymore. He said we all knew too much now." Mom started crying. Dad told him to give them more time. But he said no. He said the window closed when Ivy pointed at me, trembling, started asking questions. The room went cold. Meredith folded her arms tight across her chest. "So they agreed to his terms." "I don't know," Ivy said desperately. "I ran. I didn't even take my coat. I just ran." Detective Ramirez stood. "We're moving to the next phase. Officer Reyes, call it in. We're executing the warrant tonight." Ethan stepped closer to me, his hand finding mine. "This ends now." Ramirez turned to Ivy. "You're staying here with us. You're under protective custody until we get this man and your parents into custody." But Ivy shook her head. "You don't get it. He's everywhere. He finds things. He finds people." Her gaze darted toward the windows. "We're not safe here." Marion placed a steadying hand on Ivy's shoulder. "You did the right thing coming here. This is the safest place you could be." But Ivy only whispered, "Not for long." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered. A soft hum cut through the room. Then darkness swallowed everything. I couldn't breathe. "What happened?" Meredith gasped. "Backup generator should have kicked in." Ramirez muttered, gun drawn. "Stay behind me." Ethan grabbed my arm, pulling me close. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as we stood in the dark, every second stretching painfully slow. Then a metallic clang echoed from somewhere in the building. Ivy let out a choked sob. "He's here. He followed me. I told you." Ramirez hissed. "Everyone stay still. Officers are securing the perimeter." As if on cue, flashlights bobbed through the hallway beyond the door. Shouts, footsteps, a scuffle, something heavy hitting the floor. Then a voice called out, "Suspect detained, safe house secure." The lights flickered back on, buzzing to life. Ramirez exhaled sharply, lowering his weapon. They got him. I sagged into Ethan's arms, knees nearly giving out. Ivy covered her face, sobbing. Meredith leaned against the wall, whispering a prayer. Marion pressed a hand to her chest, eyes closed in relief. A second officer appeared in the doorway. "Detective, we've apprehended a male matching the description. Armed. No ID. Says nothing." "Good," Ramirez said. "Then let's go get the rest." Everything that happened afterward blurred into one long, breathless sequence. Multiple precincts mobilized. A judge signed emergency warrants based on Ivy's testimony and the attempt on our lives. Police vehicles roared toward my parents' house. Drones lit the night sky above Henry's property. By dawn, it was over. My parents were taken out in handcuffs, ashen stunned, screaming my name as if I was the one who had betrayed them. Henry emerged from his home silent and composed, but the moment he saw me at the precinct, something flickered behind his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or the realization that his game was finally finished. The hired enforcer refused to speak, but the evidence found in his vehicle tied every thread together. Photos of me, Ivy, my parents. Notes about our schedules. Copies of the fraudulent documents. Instructions from a burner phone traced back to Henry. It wasn't just greed. It was desperation. A collapsing estate. A forged amendment. A plan to tie everything to me, then erase me if that plan failed. But it failed. Because I didn't sign. Because Ivy finally told the truth. Because I walked away. Weeks later, after court hearings, protective orders, interviews, and a wave of shock that rolled through the entire extended family life, finally slowly resettled. I was in my new apartment, sunlight warming the kitchen floor, when Ivy knocked lightly on the open door. She looked healthier. Softer, smaller somehow without the weight of secrecy crushing her. "Can I come in?" she whispered. "Of course." She stepped inside, fingers fidgeting with the sleeves of her sweater. "I wanted to tell you something. 2 things, actually." I nodded. "First, I'm getting help. Real help. Therapy, financial counseling, restitution agreements. I'm done being who I was." I felt something loosen inside my chest. Something I didn't realize I'd been holding. "And second," she swallowed. "I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that expects forgiveness. Just the kind that needed to be said." I reached for her hand, hesitant but sincere. "We survived," I murmured. "And we're going to be okay." Her eyes filled, but she nodded. After she left, Ethan wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "It's over," he whispered. For the first time, I said, leaning into him, "I finally believe that." I looked out at the morning light spreading across a world I almost didn't live to see. I wasn't the daughter who broke her family. I was the woman who survived them and built something better. If you've ever been pressured, manipulated, or made to feel guilty for protecting your own life, I hope this story reminds you of something important. Your safety matters, Your voice matters, and walking away from toxic family is not betrayal. It's survival. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose yourself over someone who claimed to love you? What helped you take that first step? If this journey kept you engaged, please like the video, share it with someone who may need the strength, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and reclaiming your power. Your story matters, and you're not alone.